I thank you, as always, on noon on Wednesdays. Why am I going so far ahead? We are on part three. In a brief review, first week, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the precursors of Zionism, the first wave of Aliyah, 1880, the second wave of Aliyah, and really the build-up in the Jewish community until 1948. We ended with independence. Last week, we went from independence really until the tension leading up to the Six-Day War. I don't remember if I talked about that. If I did in my first slide, I can see Beth and I can see Stan, the computers on my screen. So give me a thumbs up if there's a slide I talked about last week. But we're going to be looking at a very much shorter period, not even 15 years, from the 67 Six-Day War until 1979, what I've called From Wars to Peace. Sounds like a Russian novel, but it's not. It's just the story of Israel from 1967 to 1979. One of the highlights of this period, July 4th, 1976. I'm not talking about the American bicentennial. I'm talking about the raid on Entebbe, which kind of connects to our conversation we were just having, and of course ends. I'm sorry, this is from part 4. Forget that. Next week with another handshake. Similar picture, but different era. The lead up to the Six-Day War. I don't remember if I showed you this map, but if we look at the war, at the Asia and Africa, and we look at the Middle East over there, the green was Israel from 1949 ceasefire, which I talked about last week, until 1967. And the lead up in the tension, I put this map here. Is that a thumbs up, Rabbi, because I talked about this last week? Or just a thumbs up? Anyway.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm here.
But did I talk about this last week? Does anybody remember at the end? I see a few head shaking.
You made brief mention of this.
Okay, so I changed the slide there to put this image up here because I want you to see where the Straits of Tiran here. This is Sinai and all of Egypt, and the tension escalates in May when the President Nasser had, remember last week we talked about how in 56, 4 years after his coup, Nasser decided that he was going to nationalize the Suez Canal, upsetting England and France. They colluded with Israel to launch this Operation Musketeer, which we would call the Suez Crisis or the 56 Suez War. As a result of that, the United Nations puts a number of troops in the Sinai Peninsula. It's still Egypt, but there is a peacekeeping effort. But Nasser does two things. One, he kicks out the UN, and second, he closes this area here, the Straits of Tiran, which meant that no boats could come in to our southern port of Eilat, bringing oil from Iran and other things from Asia. And escalation, both of these were seen as casus belli, as acts of war by Israel. This flurry of diplomatic activity, led by Abba Eban, a very erudite foreign minister. He went to visit your President Johnson, who told him it would be, quote, unwise to jump the gun. And 3 times he told him in conversation, according to the late historian Martin Gilbert, Israel will not be alone unless it decides to do it alone. We cannot imagine that Israel will make this decision. Very clearly saying, don't do it. America, to remind you, had a warmer relationship then with Israel than it did in 48, but still not as warm as it is today. And what happens? The tension escalates, continues to escalate. The Israel Defense Forces, which is based largely on reservists, has a discussion what to do. And they decide to call up the reservists. Now, to put it in context, not today so much. We have a much larger army in terms of real numbers of people, and the reservists are people in their 20s who were recently out of the military, people like my son's age rather than people in their 30s or 40s and early 50s. The reservists were called up, and it really brought the economy to a standstill. And there's this period of waiting. There is an alliance from 66 we talked about between Egypt and Syria. The Jordanians decide to join that alliance, and the tension continues to escalate. A national emergency government is formed, a unity government. Menachem Begin, the leader of the opposition from the right, comes in. Moshe Dayan replaces Prime Minister and Defense Minister Eshkol in his defense capacity. Eshkol was an older statesman. He wasn't a soldier. Dayan was a highly decorated soldier. People had a lot more confidence in Dayan. And finally, on June 5th, so almost 2 weeks more, almost 3 weeks after the crisis begins, the Israel Air Force sends all of its 200 planes, except a dozen, maybe some biblical significance of the number, to protect Israeli airspace. It destroyed the Egyptian Air Force while it was largely on the ground. Israel warned the Jordanian monarch, King Hussein, not to get involved. He said it's too late. The die has been cast, and Israel destroyed 374 Arab airplanes. And of course, some of you might remember this from last week or from 1967, the day of, June 5th, because it breaks out 7:45 a.m. June 5th in Israel. You wake up in the morning to see this headline. No Twitter feed at the time in 1967, of course. Some of the major figures on the Arab side. This, of course, is King Hussein, the late King Hussein, the father of current King Abdullah II, the monarch of Transjordan. And this is Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt. In this context of pan-Arabism, I didn't talk about it that much last week, but Nasser, after his revolution in 52, getting rid of King Farouk, then turned to try to unify the Arab world in this ideology of pan-Arabism, not just particular Arab nationalism of Jordan or Egypt or Syria, but unify all the Arab countries. There wasn't a lot in common, unfortunately. The greatest commonality was their animosity to Israel. 67 really was the attempt, even though the Israeli Air Force had aerial supremacy very, very quickly, was the attempt to unify the Arab world by literally pushing Israel into the sea. Already on the second day, the land operation begins in Jerusalem, and it's important that a lot of people don't even realize this. But at the beginning, Israel did not have a plan to capture the old city. Here you see the paratroopers, and this is Mota Gur, the head of the paratroop brigade. I'm circling around his head over here, from the Mount of Olives, looking to the west to the old city. They've had this pincher movement to get up on top of the mountain, and already by day 2 of the war, we can see there is Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak. There is Moshe Dayan with the eye patch, and there is Yitzhak Rabin, Dayan defense minister. Rabin over here is the commander-in-chief, and this man who's back to us, you'll see in the next picture, is Uzi Narkis. There he is. This is Uzi Narkis, the commander of the Central Front, defense minister Dayan, and commander-in-chief Yitzhak Rabin, walking in the Lion's Gate, and that famous picture, of course, of the paratroopers at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, in absolute awe, staring up for the first time in 1900 years, understanding Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem and the holy sites. As I said at the beginning, the war was a response, by and large, and this is something that comes up today as well. Israel occupied all this Palestinian land. Well, you have to ask the people you're having a conversation with, what do they mean? Do they mean 48? Do they mean 1880? Do they mean 1967? And there was a resistance within the Israeli cabinet over whether or not to take the old city of Jerusalem. The idea was that the biggest existential threats to Israel, and some of you might remember this, when Nasser begins this militant operation, there's a lot of concern that this might be the end of Israel. Graves are being dug in public parks in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. People are thinking this is the end. And by the 7th day, it's all over. And there was no plan, as I said, to enter the old city. And in fact, the members of the government of the National Religious Party were those who were opposed, believe it or not, to having a battle to take the old city. Thankfully, there was not a lot of blood spilt in the old city. Obviously, tanks and airplanes weren't involved. It was mostly infantry, almost exclusively infantry with some artillery shelling. But the euphoria, as Israeli soldiers climb up there, put up the Israeli flag in front of the gold dome of the Dome of the Rock, and there you can see another picture of the triumphant Israeli soldiers. And one soldier says on the radio, Mota Gur, the commander of the paratroop brigade, picks this up, "The Temple Mount is in our hands. Har Habayit biyadenu." Phenomenal, euphoric experience, even for secular Israelis, because to understand the significance of this, you have to go back a few thousand years, that it's not only the place where the Holy of Holies was in our first and second temples, it's also the place where Avram bound Yitzchak on Mount Moriah. It's also theologically the navel of the world. So it's a very important piece of real estate. And for the first time since the 9th of Av of 70, we have this in our hands. However, 10 days later, on the 17th of June, 1967, that same defense minister, Moshe Dayan, over here, decides to meets with the Arab Islamic leadership on top of the Dome of the Rock and gives control of the holy sites of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the Muslim leadership. Very quickly, the Israeli soldiers are told to take that flag down from the top of the Temple Mount. It's still a big bone of contention between Israel and the Palestinians, but we're not up to the contemporary area. Just that same map I showed you a few minutes ago, but another part of it. Here's the map I showed you. The green, Israel 49 until the outbreak of the 67 war. And look at what happens. As a result of this war, in 2 days, the massive area of the Sinai Peninsula, and look at how big the Sinai in light green is compared to all of Israel. It's 2.5 times just the Sinai, the size of Israel pre-67, and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and this area of the Golan Heights, not very big, about 50 miles from the top to bottom, about 12, 15 miles wide at its widest, about 450 square miles. That captures from Syria. Day 7, and the war is finally over. And the question is, okay, so what does this all mean? What were the consequences of the Six-Day War? As I said, being a Jewish state, we had to rest on the 7th day, realizing that we, the little David, had defeated Goliath, tripled in size, but we also now had 1 million more Palestinian Arabs under our control, and there were hundreds of thousands of refugees who fled at the same time. Listen to the announcement 2 days after the end of the war, on the 12th of June, by Prime Minister Eshkol. A week ago, the fateful campaign began. The existence of the State of Israel hung in the balance, the hopes of generations, and the vision that was realized in our own time. During the fighting, our forces destroyed about 450 enemy planes and hundreds of tanks. The enemy forces were decisively defeated. Many fled for their lives. For the first time since the establishment of the state, the threat to our security has been removed. At once, from the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the northern border. Phenomenal week-long events that totally transfigured and still, I think, colors what's happening in this part of the world and internally what's happening in Israel. Less than 2 weeks after the war, Israel offered to return all of the Sinai and to Egypt and the Golan to Syria and parts of the West Bank. They would be willing to negotiate with Jordan. But the Arab League, the meeting of all the Arab countries, met in Sudan, and they issued their famous 3 no's. No to recognition of your right to exist, no to negotiation, and no to making any peace with the State of Israel. The central issue to come out of the war, from Israel's internal point of view, was what do we do with all of these territories? There were some early prophets who said, not good, occupation bad, this is going to come to haunt us. And there are others who said, no, this is a sign of God being part of history, and we're making a closer step to the arrival of the Messiah. And if you look at Israel, really since 67 until not that long ago, I think one of, if not the major rift in Israeli society between right and left, hawks and doves, is the question over what to do with the territories captured in 67. Different responses to different territories we'll see later vis-a-vis peace with Jordan in 94, peace with Egypt in the late 70s as well. It was incredible. And it's still studied in military academies all over the world. So this surprise attack on 3 fronts, tragically, internally, led to a complacency that ultimately became overconfidence that led up to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, a short 6 years later. 2 days, that's all it took the Sinai campaign. And to put it in context, Sinai, as I said, it's not going backwards, Sinai is about 2.5 times of all of Israel. Very, very quick. The Air Force, the artillery, the armored corps, you name it, capturing this massive piece of land. There was some oil there, not a huge Bedouin population. Bedouins are still there, but it was successful in that the biggest enemy that Israel faced, and the leader of this campaign against Israel, Egypt under Nasser, was pushed much, much farther away from our civilian populations. And here you can see on the last 2 days of the war, fighting up in the Golan Heights from 2 areas, just below where it is now snowing quite heavily, Mount Hermon up over here. What's amazing is that the war begins on the 5th on the southern front and then expands to the central front with Jordan and Jerusalem and the West Bank. And it only in the last 2 days is they're fighting up in the north on the Golan Heights. Why? Because the government was very reluctant to go up to the Golan Heights. It knew very well that there was a very heavy price that would have to be paid if Israel were to ascend the Golan Heights, and so reluctantly it did so when it realized the vulnerability of the Syrians up on the Golan. Perhaps the best story or the best account of this 6-day war was the book 6 Days of War by Michael Oren. Many of you I'm sure read before he became ambassador to Washington. And about 1.5 years ago, I heard Ambassador Oren speak on a Zoom call, and fascinating, 40, 50 plus years after the war, some of his takeaways, not from this book, but some of his takeaways in general of the war. It gave Israel the land to make peace with Egypt a decade later. Very, very, very important. Might not have been able to do that. It led to a strategic alliance, as I said earlier, a growing, warming relationship with the U.S. American Jewry, and some of you might remember this, was transformed because the first time It gave Americans much more political power. There was a greater sense of pride in the Jewish community. And really, the idea of the Holocaust not being something that was shunned aside in Israel as well, by the way, was more publicly spoken about in America. This is all Michael Oren. Soviet Jewry behind the Iron Curtain, a tremendous sense of pride in Jewish identity. A small movement of immigration, late 60s, early 70s, was sparked. Keep in mind, the Soviets supplied the three Arab countries, and in many ways, this could be seen as a victory of Western Israel against the Soviets, except Israel still wasn't getting any weapons from the United States. It reconnected the state of Israel with the land of Israel. The biblical heartland, the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, all of a sudden comes under Israeli control. He says, ironically as well, it was good for the Palestinians. It put them on the map. And a mere 8 years later, Yasser Arafat, you remember, the olive branch in his hand and his gun in his holster, spoke at the United Nations. And he writes in his book, if the war was indeed a storm that altered the region's landscape, it also exposed the underlying nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict, its bedrock. The modern Middle East, created in 1967, was therefore a hybrid, a region of incipient promise, but also of imminent dangers, a mixture of old contexts and new. And we oftentimes still hear the term the Arab-Israeli conflict. I challenge that, because I don't think there is an Arab-Israeli conflict anymore. There are issues that Israel has in bilateral relations. We've got, and we'll see in the coming weeks, lots of relations with lots of Arab countries in the region. There is an Arab-Palestinian conflict, no question. The second, perhaps most famous image to come out of the war was this famous Life magazine picture of an Israeli soldier with a Russian Kalashnikov rifle in the Suez Canal. And Oren ends one last quote from Oren in his book. Rarely has so short and localized a conflict had such prolonged global consequences. Seldom has the world's attention been gripped and remained seized by a single event and its ramifications. In a very real sense, for statesmen and diplomats and soldiers, the war has never ended. For historians, it has only just begun. He, of course, is a historian before anything else. But in many ways, I think these two quotes that I picked from Oren's book give you a sense of the significance, the ongoing significance of the 6 days of war. And here, the last picture from the war is Rabbi Goren, the chief rabbi of the IDF, who later becomes the chief rabbi of Israel, blowing the shofar at the wall, of course, at the Western Wall inside the Old City. It's not the last war, unfortunately. It's the first of the three wars, the war of attrition. Like 56 last week, the Sinai campaign, oftentimes this one gets overlooked, unfortunately. The U.S. agrees after the Sixth War to send Israel 50 Phantom planes in December 68, the first weapons deal from America to Israel. In the spring of 69, President Nasser said that he didn't recognize that ceasefire from 67, and he gave up hope that there was any diplomatic pressure to convince Israel to withdraw from Sinai. And so all along the Suez Canal, here you see Israeli soldiers. You can see the distance, not very far. There's the Suez Canal. You know how wide the Suez Canal is. It's about as wide as a huge boat that's got lots of packages from Amazon for people like you that got stuck not that long ago, right? It's not that big of a place. Most of us, and I can barely swim, could probably swim across the Suez Canal. So the Egyptians tried to wear down, today, to put it in context, Israel is 9.3 million people. There are 100 million Egyptians. It's a much larger country. Daily barrages across the Suez Canal tried to wear Israel down. Golda Meir, in the midst of this conflict, becomes prime minister as Levi Eshkol, her predecessor, dies, relatively young in 1969. That same year, almost sparking Armageddon in Jerusalem, a crazy Australian Christian, Michael Rohan, comes and sets fire the Al-Aqsa Mosque, causes a lot of issues, and the Palestinians thought that Israel was behind it, but it wasn't. And finally, about a year and a half after it began, a ceasefire in the summer of 1970, Israeli Phantoms went deep, American-supplied Phantoms went deep into Egypt territory. The Egyptians, however, were supplied with the most sophisticated Russian surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles, of course. Lots of damage on both sides and loss of life. And not only, once it ended, more than anything else, without a full-scale war really taking place, this kind of slow year-plus constant daily barrages, ultimately it marks the increased involvement of the Soviets, and of the Americans in the Middle East. I talked last week about the Wadi Salib in the first decade of Israel, the Moroccan protest that took place in Haifa, last week you might remember, that spread all over the country. And then I alluded to what we're going to see this week. They're the Black Panthers. They didn't spell very well in English. It wasn't as important a subject back then. You can see, taking their name from the American Black Panthers. But the Hebrew sign says, until when will 10 people live in a family? The Panthers. And it was a social protest. Even though there was social protest, as I said, 15 years after what started in Haifa, starts in Jerusalem in two neighborhoods, Musrara and the Katamonim. And Golda Meir ultimately meets with them. And as I said last week, she said they were not nice. But to her credit, she did create a committee to deal with underprivileged youth. And as I said last week, this issue of the Sephardic Mizrahi underclass, who comes to Israel largely post-1948, forcibly evicted from countries in which their families had lived for centuries, if not millennia, not allowed to take any money with them, and put into these tents that became shacks, that became public housing estates in development towns in the periphery. It is still a major issue within Israeli society, and this was that second wave of protest. 1972, some of you might even remember the ABC live broadcast of the Olympics. Palestinian terrorism had increased in the late 60s and 70s. There were attacks at the airport. You might remember the Japanese Red Star Army. There were German attacks, Germans together with Palestinians. There was this horrible attack at the airport. 24 people were killed. And then in the fall, September 5th, 1972, these horrible images that, again, the world saw live on television on ABC. 11 Israeli athletes were murdered by a group called Black September. Black September was part of the Palestine Liberation Organization, formed in September 70. Remember 2 weeks ago I said, there's more that I don't include in my sessions than I do include. I'm not talking about how King Hussein in 1970 forcibly evicts the PLO from Jordan because they're threatening his regime. Israel helps King Hussein, the Syrians help the PLO, and the PLO go out to Lebanon. Thousands of PLO were killed, and there's a new group within the PLO formed called Black September, commemorating this Black Month when their King Hussein killed thousands of PLO. This group then went and killed the Israeli athletes, tragically. The Olympics continued, and just a few months later, Germans released 3 of the terrorists who had survived because they had kidnapped a German airplane and demanded their release. And here the picture of the 11 Israeli athletes. It took until the Olympics, the Summer Olympics this year were held, somebody remind me, the Summer Olympics this year in Japan, right? Until this year's Summer Olympics in Japan, where they finally asked for a moment of silence for the 11 Israeli athletes, and there was something added onto it as well, and others who have been killed or whatever else. And some of the spouses of those athletes were actually in Tokyo this past summer. So that's 1972. We move on, unfortunately, to the Yom Kippur War. This is where my own personal memory, it's no longer history, it's part of memory, because I was 9 in October of 1973. President Nasser dies. His number 2, Anwar Sadat, takes over. And he says, just a few months before the war, that he was willing to sacrifice 1 million soldiers to regain lost territory. Now, it's really important to understand, in this part of the world, like in other parts of the world maybe, there is a tremendous attachment to real estate. And the fact that a leader is prepared to sacrifice 1 million of his own citizens to get back a territory that isn't really that essential to Egypt. There's not a lot of agriculture there. There's a little bit of oil, but not much more. More than anything else, it is a question of pride. And American Secretary of State Kissinger asked one of Sadat's advisors if he was willing to agree to peace in return for Sinai, but he never got a response. So not quite clear what's going on with Sadat on the one hand. Israeli intelligence thought that there was a low probability of a Syrian-Egyptian attack. However, the defense minister Dayan, remember appointed in 1967, meets Prime Minister Golda Meir, who also didn't have a military background, and told her that the Egyptian in the south and Syrian in the north troop movements were somewhat unusual, but war was not imminent. The next day, the chief of military intelligence said that hostilities could begin without a warning, but the commander-in-chief of IDF, David Elazar, said that's not going to happen. The same day, a very high source, the son-in-law of Nasser, who's passed away, of course, who was working on behalf of Israel, told Israel that Egypt was going to attack the next day. Now, ultimately, that's what happens? That next day, or the day after actually, Elazar, the commander-in-chief, puts the IDF on the highest level of alert and orders a limited mobilization of reservists. Not enough to really stop a very, very heavy assault from Egypt and from Syria. Golda Meir on the radio announces Yom Kippur, many of us remember it. Citizens of Israel, today at around 2 p.m., the Egyptian and Syrian armies launched an attack against Israel. They carried out a series of Air Force, Armored Corps, and artillery assaults in Sinai and the Golan Heights. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, meets journalists the next day, 2 days later, on the 8th of October, and he said that this situation might lead to the destruction of the Third Temple. Within 2 weeks, a first ceasefire came into effect, but I remember as a 9-year-old, a real palpable sense that Israel might disappear. Now, why? We'll see that in a minute. Maybe the cockiness of Israeli military and political leadership. Why would they attack us when we defeated 3 of their armies in a week's time? Look at a couple more maps to give you an understanding of the context. The yellow and light brown was Israel pre-1967, right? The yellow was Israel 49 to 67. The brown additions, Golan Heights, West Bank, Gaza, and Egypt, were added in the 67 war. But look what happens after the war. This little area along the Suez Canal here is retaken by Egypt, and this little area up over here is held by Israel until in May of 74, so it takes 6 months at least, the Americans negotiate a ceasefire agreement, and here you can see this line over here marks the area that Israel had controlled after the Six-Day War. So the original border was here, where I'm moving, the original border in October 73. Israel retaliated and went further into Syria. To put it in context, from this place over here, Quneitra, where many of you have stood, Mount Bental, it's 40 miles to Damascus. So Damascus is about here. Israel is about 20 miles away from Damascus, returned that land, and all of the purple relinquished as a result of the 73 war. So there were 2 small relinquishments of territory, the purple piece over here to Syria by Israel, and the 2 red pieces over here by Israel to Egypt. No peace, of course, 1973 Yom Kippur War. Some of the main figures, some of the images you might remember from the war, the Israeli tanks crossing the Suez Canal. You can see David Elazar, the commander-in-chief, on the right-hand side, leader of military intelligence, southern commander. The air supply coming from the United States. It's important, maybe people don't realize this, but Nixon was president at the time, and he responded to a Soviet shipment of weapons to the Syrians and the Egyptians. And so the Americans, the first time outside of the 50 Phantoms in 1968, sent a massive airlift of weapons to Israel. And here you can see Moshe Dayan, the famous general, later on prime minister, but he led thousands of Israeli troops across the Suez Canal and encircled one of the major Egyptian armies that ultimately surrendered, and that was really kind of the end of the campaign on the Sinai, on the Egyptian front. There is David Elazar, commander-in-chief, and Moshe Dayan. You can see looking quite traumatized, and Golda Meir, the prime minister at the time. Again, just the central figures. But the problem, of course, with this war was that in sharp contrast to the war beforehand, when we lost 700 Israeli soldiers, but it was this miraculous victory of David defeating Goliath in less than a week's time and winning 3 wars in 1 week. Crazy. Yom Kippur War was traumatic. Almost 3,000 Israelis were killed. Many more were injured. And the leadership, as I mentioned, was seen as being prisoner to this security concept that the Arab countries wouldn't attack us once again. There's a commission of inquiry that's established, which essentially says the Israeli army chief held this conception that Egypt wouldn't attack Israel, etc., and Syria wouldn't attack with Egypt. Well, here is the committee. There is the Justice Al-Granat, who comes up, and ultimately he says, okay, David Elazar, the commander-in-chief, his termination was recommended. Other military officers were blamed. However, Dayan was not found culpable. The report said as long as he accepts the opinions of his advisors, he doesn't bear any personal responsibility. And the one who did was, unfortunately, David Elazar. 3 years later, in 1976, in his early 50s, he dies, has a heart attack while swimming, probably as a result of the trauma of the responsibility. What were the major consequences? As I mentioned earlier, Nixon, major airlift, not because he was a lover of Jews or of the state of Israel, but in the context of the Cold War, of course. The next year, later that year, December, there were elections, and Golda Meir's party dropped from 56 to 51 seats. Remember, only 120 seats in the Knesset. Those 56 seats that Golda Meir's led Labor Party won in the late 60s after the Six-Day War were the most ever won by any political party, but she lost 10% of her votes in the elections after the war. Golda then resigns. Yitzhak Rabin becomes later the leader of the Labor Party. And then major consequences, in this case, as cited by the historian Martin Gilbert, this growing Israeli dependence on the U.S., this breaking of third world countries' relations with Israel in the context of the Cold War and identifying with Egypt and Syria. There was this psychological breakthrough. Who did I mention? Michael Oren mentioned it in that in his book, in the lecture about a year and a half ago, that it gave Israel this big enough land that psychologically allowed it, together with this Yom Kippur War, to lead to the Egyptian-Israeli peace. The oil embargo, all of us remember the trebling of the cost of oil and rationing and waiting in line to fill up our cars, the power of OPEC, and profound internal consequences within Israeli society. It really shook the foundation of Israel, including the ultimate fall of the Labor Party, which had been in control since even before 1948. A couple other major events right after the war. The settler movement, Gush Emonim, the Bloc of the Faithful, begins in 1974. Here you can see them settling in their first permanent settlement in the West Bank called Ktumim. And it ultimately, this protest against the government led to a pattern that led to many, many more settlements. Keep in mind, it's 1974. It's Yitzhak Rabin as Prime Minister, Defense Minister Shimon Peres. The first settlement in the West Bank in Judea Samaria is under the labor control. Not that it supported it, but labor was in power at the time. More terrorist activities, unfortunately, the Ma'alot Massacre in 1974. The UN passed a resolution equating Zionism with racism, and our ambassador at the United Nations, Chaim Herzog, whose son is Bougie Herzog, our current president, and whose wife, Ora Herzog, just passed away last week at the ripe old age of 97. Chaim Herzog was the ambassador to the UN, ripped up very demonstratively, I remember watching it on TV, this resolution equating Zionism with racism in 75. And there was a protest within Israel by the Israeli Arabs over Israel taking over land in the Galilee, confiscating land agricultural land, empty land maybe, in order to build Jewish communities. And this is a day of protest every March 30th within Israel by the Israeli Arabs over their perspective on Israel taking the land of citizens of Israel, not to justify, but not in West Bank or Gaza, but Israeli Arab citizens. And then, of course, this very important watershed event in 1976, end of June, beginning of July, an Air France plane is hijacked. It's taken to Entebbe, Uganda, and there was this incredible rescue operation led by, and here you can see everybody, including the French crew. The pilot, I think, just died about a year ago, who refused to leave. All of the aircrew refused to leave the Jews who were in captivity in Entebbe. And here you can see Yoni Netanyahu, older brother of our former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the lieutenant colonel, the commander of the force from Sayeret Matkal, the most elite unit in the IDF. And this really was a phenomenal event that helped restore self-confidence in Israel after this debacle of 73, and in the context of this real sense of helplessness amongst a growing wave of terrorism. Later that year, Israel took the first delivery of F-15s. Unfortunately, the ceremony ended just after Shabbat began. Now, the rule in Israel is that the government must follow, according to tradition from the beginning, that all offices have to be kosher and businesses are closed on Shabbat, etc. The Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox, who are members of the government, they asked for a vote of non-confidence. When that failed, the Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, removed them from the government, but he then had to go to new elections because he was no longer in a comfortable majority situation. During the campaign, there is a discovery by an Israeli journalist that Yitzhak Rabin's wife, Leah, while he was ambassador to Washington, had a foreign bank account and left it there. You couldn't have foreign currency bank accounts in Israel in the 70s. He resigned and Shimon Peres became the leader of the Labor Party. And that was a loss from the Labor point of view. We'll see that later on. But before that, something totally unrelated to politics and warfare is perhaps the most important sporting event in Israeli history ever, where the professional basketball team Maccabi Tel Aviv defeats the Soviet team from Moscow, CSKA Moscow, and then later on wins another team, I think from Serbia, and wins the European Cup champion, the professional cup in all of Europe. Phenomenal. Not just the Six-Day War, not just the 73 War, but defeating Moscow in basketball. Wow. We are on the map. We're staying on the map, not just in sports and everything. The captain, Tal Brody, this is him, who is an American, who comes to Israel, plays for the United States, the Maccabi, makes Aliyah, and becomes the captain of the team. There you can see Elsie Perry, a 7-foot-something African-American who moves to Israel, converts to Judaism, and for light entertainment, I've added a very short, for those who are not basketball fans, the first person you'll see in this movie is Bill Walton, the former Portland Trailblazer star. This is Bill Walton describing the miraculousness, it's not miracle on X, it's even better, of this victory.
It is easily one of the greatest sporting accomplishments ever. All that excitement, all that pride, it just came out of my heart.
This guy, he said something that was in our heart.
That was Tal Brody.
It is.
He was the guy who, this guy said, this is the guy who said something that was in our heart. Why is this not going to the next slide? Whatever. That was 1977. That was, some would say, more important than the election in May, when the in the spring when the Likud party won. The first version in between Maccabi winning the basketball championship and Begin being elected was the launching of Israel's own Merkava tank. We're on Series 4 or Series 5 of that. But that same week, Menachem Begin won the election. Now, again, in Israel, you don't vote. It's not like in America where the person who gets the most votes wins. Oh, no, sorry, that doesn't work that way in America either, but it doesn't matter. It's a different system in Israel. In Israel, parties, you vote for a party, whatever percentage of the party, that party gets the popular vote. They get the percentage of seats in the Knesset, 120 seats in our parliament, the Knesset. Golda's election in the late 60s had 56 seats, right? Shimon Peres went from 50 seats to 32 seats. That's huge, a drop. And Begin went from 39 to 43 seats. So Begin increased his support by about 10%. But what happened? So I got to plug this. Begin increased his support, but it was the Labor Party that actually lost more support. So it's oftentimes referred to as the revolution or the upheaval or the Yom Kippur of politics, as it marked the end of the political hegemony of the Labor Party. Begin, the first act actually of government when he becomes prime minister was to grant asylum to Vietnamese boat people, the first country in the world really that did so. It's pretty amazing. And then perhaps the most important event up until now in the presentation is my bar mitzvah in Jerusalem at the Western Wall on August 22nd. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. Okay, some might say that 3 months later when Sadat comes to Jerusalem, it's even more important than when Mike Hollander and his family comes to Jerusalem, but you can judge. Here is the election, the news. This is Chaim Yavin, who was like Harry Reisner and Walter Cronkite and everyone kind of all in one, because we only had one TV station until not that long ago. And I added a few subtitles, The Revolution in Israeli Politics. I love the hair from 77, and even more than that, the people sitting in the background, you'll see them. But amazing, you won't understand all of the Hebrew. I've added the English. Just look at the stoic face on Mr. Television, Chaim Yavin, announcing the election results.
לפני 3 דקות ננעלו הקלפיות ברחבי הארץ, ובשעה זו מתחילה ספירת הקולות, קולות שיקבעו את דמותה של הכנסת הבאה, הכנסת התשיעית. מאבק בחירות בין חצי שנה מן הקשים שידעה ישראל.
See the hair in the back? He said this is the hardest, one of the most difficult election campaigns Israel has had ever.
מעודה מגיע לסיומו, ובעוד שעות ספורות נדע את תוצאותיו, מי זכה בו ומי הפסיד. שוב, תחזית בלבד, ולא מוסמכת, תחזית המנבאת, ניצחון ברור למחל על פני המערך. כן, כנראה לא פחות מאשר מהפך. מהפכה חלה בישראל. עלייתו של מחל למקום ראשון, סיום ההגמוניה של תנועת הפועלים מזה שנים רבות.
Quite a traumatic response, you can see. Total surprise, as I said, A combination of Labor Party losing, but also more than that, combination of Begin getting more votes than he had in the previous election, but even more than that, the drop in the lack of confidence within the Labor Party. Just after the election campaign, visit the Western Wall. This is where I had my bar mitzvah. I actually have some rare family pictures. That is me. No, that's not me. That's somebody else at the Kotel a little bit later. Sorry. That's another guy from Rome. This is me. That's me putting on my tefillin at the wall. It was a very hot day. That's me and my older brother. It was a really hot day. It was like 104 degrees or something. I never thought I'd actually make it. And lo and behold, I made Aliyah, whatever it was, 11 years later. And two of my three kids, my eldest son and my youngest son, we have a daughter in the middle, the boys both swore their oath of allegiance to Tzahal at the Western Wall, which is interesting. And then when I was putting this together, I said, I'm curious, I remember my bar mitzvah parsha, but I remember the name, but I don't remember the story. And I looked at it, and the opening line was, when you take the field against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers you into your power. It's the rules of warfare. I'm thinking, who would have thought when I was a 13-year-old kid sweating, schlepping this Torah scroll at the Western Wall, that I'd have two boys who would actually have to learn how to deal with having to fight if they had to.
It was an event so
Later on, in 1977, November, President Sadat decides no more war. He's going to get in a plane and he's going to go to Jerusalem. Now, I don't know how many of you were in Israel before November 77, but I distinctly remember coming back from Israel, and within 3 months, he's gone to Israel. And I never thought that could have happened, because me, like the rest of the Jewish world, was traumatized from the Yom Kippur War. And here, 4 years later, he said, that's it, I'm getting on a plane. And if anybody would have asked me on my bar mitzvah, August 22nd, hey, do you think as a bar mitzvah present that Sadat is going to come to Israel and there's going to be peace with Israel and Egypt? I would have said, are you kidding? What are you talking about? But here's some reflection, 2 minutes on the 40th anniversary of Sadat coming to Jerusalem.
unbelievable. One of the main players thought it could be a hoax. 40 years later, it is still viewed as a turning point for the region. On November 19, 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat landed at Lod Airport outside of Tel Aviv, the first by an Arab leader to Israel. The speech he gave at the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is to this day credited with changing the geopolitics of the entire Middle East, opening the path for peace between Israel and its neighbors and shaping a new agenda of political relations. Amazingly, the trip had been arranged less than 1 week earlier and would come about in the most public of ways. The United States was fruitlessly trying to arrange a peace conference in Switzerland when Sadat told American anchor Walter Cronkite that he'd like to head to Israel to address the parliament directly.
I'm just waiting for the proper invitation.
If you get that formal invitation, how soon are you prepared to go?
Really, I'm looking forward to fulfill this visit in the earliest time possible.
Later that same day, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin told Cronkite on live TV that the invitation was there, and he'd personally go to meet Sadat at the airport. No back-channel talks, no diplomatic cables, everything out there for the world to see and hear. Begin would address the Egyptian people over the air.
There is no reason whatsoever for hostility between our peoples. In ancient times, Egypt and Eretz Israel were allies, real friends and allies against a common enemy from the north. Yes, indeed, many changes have taken place since those days, but perhaps the intrinsic basis for friendship and mutual help remains unaltered.
Some in Begin's camp, though, thought it was too good to be true. Process that lasted 16 months before a peace treaty brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter was eventually signed by Begin and Sadat on the White House lawn in March of 1979.
Now, what was the motivation of Sadat? Why did he go from what he was saying just before, just before the Yom Kippur War, if we have to sacrifice, 4 months before the war, if we have to sacrifice 1 million Egyptian soldiers, we will do so in order to reclaim the Sinai. What happened in Sadat, we don't know. Unfortunately, he was murdered in 80-81 by the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's something to keep in mind as well. The Muslim Brotherhood under Nasser, the Muslim Brotherhood under Sadat, and then under Mubarak, and a very harsh I don't even want to use the word benevolent dictatorships under these three leaders, under Mubarak and Sadat and Nasser, of course, but very harsh to the opposition. And the Muslim Brotherhood is a fanatical Islamic organization that spawned something called Hamas. We'll meet in a couple, actually next week in our fourth session in the Gaza Strip in 1987, 1988. And so what was it? Was it the poverty in Egypt? Was it the recognition after 1948 and 1956 and 1967 and the War of Attrition 70-71 and the Yom Kippur War 73? That's 5 wars. From 48 to 73, Egypt was not making any progress. In fact, the exact opposite. They had lost a lot more. And one of the challenges in Israel-Egypt relationships to this very day is this recognition that the leadership, the military, and the political leadership is very much wants to continue the peace with Israel, but that notion of peaceful relations with Israel has not yet has not yet trickled down to the Egyptian population. So that was 1977. Why is it doing this? Sorry, guys. I want to go back to the main screen. So in the midst of the negotiations, it's crazy, between Israel and Egypt, there is an operation launched by Israel in March of 78 called Litani Operation. The Litani is a river in southern Lebanon, but south of that river and to the border with Israel is where the PLO, from being forcibly evicted out of Jordan in 1970, settles in southern Lebanon, and they established a state within a state and terror network in southern Lebanon. And dozens of terror incidents. I talked a few minutes ago about the murder of 24 students in Ma'alot in 1974. Terrorists come by boat, they land off the Mediterranean coast, they hijack a bus, 35 Israelis were killed in the shootout, and it almost derailed the Egyptian-Israeli peace process. In response, Israel launched an operation into southern Lebanon to try to find the basis from where the PLO terrorists were actually exporting their terrorism to Israel. Egyptians were very upset by this, of course, and forced an Israeli withdrawal after 6 days. The United Nations met and set up an interim force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, in the spring of 1978, based on UN resolutions, in order to confirm Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon and to ensure, which it did, and to ensure that the Lebanese government would restore its effective authority in the area. Unfortunately, the Lebanese government still is unable to effectively restore its authority in this area, as you'll see a little bit more next week and the week after that. Twice, the mandate of UNIFIL had to be adjusted. Once, after the first Lebanese war, we'll meet next week in 1982, and after Israel's withdrawal in 2000. Then there was another Lebanese war. We'll meet in 3 weeks' time, unfortunately, in 2006. After that, the UN increased the number of soldiers in UNIFIL, and in addition to its original mandate, it would monitor the cessation of hostilities, extend humanitarian aid, etc., etc. Unfortunately, the United Nations interim force is still there, 4 now, when I put this together, it was 2021, 44 years later. There's nothing more permanent than something interim in the Middle East, and you can see by the pictures here in a recent UNIFIL map, there are various, that's not America, that is Samoa or something, I don't know where that flag is, but these are the different nationalities with the number of soldiers in this area. This is the Litani River over here, more or less, up over here, and this is Israel down here, this is Lebanon, Golan Heights, Syria, etc., and this is where the UNIFIL is today. But notice the UNIFIL, there they are, their blue helmets, and there's their UN armored vehicle, right next to a picture of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. Here you can see there were protests of Hezbollah. You see the yellow flags, that's Hezbollah. This is Israel over here. This is the fence. So they're here to monitor. But I guarantee you, the UNIFIL soldiers do not get in the way of Israelis or Lebanese if there's any conflict. They're kind of there to, 15,000 of them, to just monitor, to make sure that there aren't too many forces close to the border. But if violence escalates, they come out, they get out very quickly. You might remember a few years ago, there were a number of UN who were kidnapped in Lebanon. It's a crazy situation, but it's our northern neighbor. In the meantime, the discussion is happening. There is Sadat, there's Foreign Minister Chaim Weizmann at the time. And these are all quotes from Weizmann, who was the foreign minister, but he had been he had been commander of the Air Force, and he had been defense minister as well. He saw, and he became president later on. Weizmann, in terms of Sadat, he saw that Sadat wanted to extricate himself from this Russian bear hug and replace it with an American caress. One, as I said earlier, the Egyptians have not successfully defeated Israel. They've lost territory. They want to get it back. One. Two, very unhappy with this Russian bear hug, and they're more happy to have this American caress. Prime Minister Begin, Foreign Minister Weizmann, Defense Minister Dan are meeting Sadat in Egypt, and the discussions break down. Ultimately, Carter then invites them, President Carter, to come to Camp David, where they would stay until they reached an agreement. Almost 2 weeks into Camp David, Israel agreed to return the Sinai to Egypt and remove all Jewish settlers. The first time that Israel made a decision, late 70s, and implemented it by April of 82, to remove all Jewish settlers from a particular piece of territory captured in this war. Then have a period of 3 to 5 years of Palestinian autonomy, where? In Gaza and in the West Bank. Gaza was not going back to Egypt. Although Israel captured Gaza from Egypt with Sinai in 67, the Egyptians didn't want it. The Egyptians were paying, I believe, lip service to the Palestinians and saying, okay, you will have Palestinian autonomy discussions in 3 to 5 years toward a permanent solution to the Palestinians. Begin, however, wasn't too keen on there being a Palestinian state. And ultimately, this framework for peace in the Middle East led to the first signing at Camp David in March in 1979. And Weizmann, the foreign minister, beautiful line, said, I think years later on this, in the late 90s, wrote, "The greatness of leaders is measured by their ability to free themselves of past slogans and outdated opinions and understand the historical currents. This was the greatness of Sadat, Begin, and Carter as it manifested itself at Camp David." 2 more pictures from the yearbook, the 3 statesmen. And it's important to realize that the American involvement wasn't from the beginning. Sadat surprised the Americans by saying, I'm going to, and read, there's a new biography about diplomacy by by Martin Indyk, the former American ambassador to Israel, about Kissinger's understanding and involvement in all of this back in the 73. Of course, he's no longer in power at this time, but the Americans were very surprised by Sadat's unilateral move to go to Israel. Ultimately, the peace was only ironed out when the 3 men were quarantined without corona for 12 days in Camp David. So there's the signing on the White House lawn, March 26, 1979. I remember watching it on TV. The entire world, Egypt and Israel, signed a formal treaty ending a state of war after 30 years. Sadat and etc. praised Carter's role. Called for Israeli withdrawal of all of Sinai within 3 years. It happened by April 82. Peace and normalization, free passage for Israeli vessels through the Suez Canal, and after the signing, negotiations for Palestinian autonomy would begin. They began, but nothing ever really, there was no traction on that front, and we'll see next week when the first Palestinian Intifada breaks out 8 years later in December of 1987. In many ways, it's a response to the control of Israel of Gaza and the West Bank, or the occupation, and it's also a response to the kind of abandonment of the Arab world of the Palestinians. And with that, I turn it over to questions and answers before we go to next week, and we go from the late 1970s until, where am I going? Until 1998. I can breathe. Questions?
Takes everyone a second just to breathe with you, Mike. So, but it looks like Larry Domont has his hand up.
Mike, you mentioned that it was the Yom Kippur War that resulted in the third world countries and much of the world going against Israel, and ultimately, I guess, the UN resolution condemning Zionism. Can you explain why that occurred?
Well, there are a couple things. There's one important piece that I didn't really talk about, was how in the 50s and 60s, Israel turned to the developing world and offered all sorts of assistance, economic assistance, which it didn't really have, but more importantly, agricultural assistance in Africa. And post-1945, the world was divided very much along the East-West axis, the Soviet bloc and the Western world. But there were a lot of other countries, emerging countries, developing countries, that were not affiliated or aligned with either of those. So India and then Nasser himself were very involved in this movement of non-aligned countries. So Israel had a kind of intentionally sought countries that weren't aligned with the Soviets or with the Americans to provide agricultural economic support, particularly Africa, a little bit in Asia as well. Israel also reached out to non-Arab Islamic countries in the Middle East, Turkey and Iran, and had close relations with them as well. But as a result of kind of this use domino would make us think differently. But because of 67, the Soviet satellites lost to a Western allied, but not yet fully Western supported, i.e. American supported Israel. But by 73, it was already a different situation, right? In 67, I already said there was this growth of identity of Jews in the Soviet Union and an immigration wave. But by 73, because of the economic pressure of the Arab countries in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, right? Venezuela is also part of OPEC. Nigeria is also part of OPEC. Indonesia, these are all countries that are part of this organization. But it was largely the Arab influence that led to this massive escalation of the price of oil. It led to this kind of much more assertive pressure of the Soviets against Israel in 1973. So it was kind of this process that I think accelerated from 67 to 1973. And what's amazing, and I think about it even more, Larry, after your question, is it wasn't just that Sadat, vis-a-vis his own people, was going out to Israel, but vis-a-vis his entire world, the Middle East, the non-aligned countries, and the Islamic world and the Arab world as well. So even more so. But it took from 79 to 94 to get the second treaty with another country. So I don't know if I answered your question. I raised more questions for you, Larry, but one thing I will say, and that is in terms of understanding what's happening in the Middle East. I said this today, and I'll mention it a few times in the next couple of weeks. I don't believe there is an Arab-Israeli conflict anymore. I didn't think there ever was. The term Arab-Israeli conflict was something used to describe everything in the Middle East, and that everything that Israel does, building another settlement, expanding a neighborhood in eastern Jerusalem, would lead to destabilization in the Middle East. There was a linkage, a false linkage between what's happening in what Israel does and instability in the entire neighborhood. The fact that the Arab Spring happens in 2011, 2010 has got nothing to do with Israel's occupation of Palestine. It has to do with issues within the Middle East. And there's always been this linkage. And 67 and 73 and breaking off of diplomatic relations and the Arab boycott. I didn't even mention this. Thank you for raising a question, Larry. The Arab countries said, if you do business with Israel, we won't do business with you. And there was a secondary and a tertiary level. If I'm not going to do business with a company that does business with a company that does business with Israel. Crazy. And so that's why Pepsi and Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut never came here. In 1991, when we bought our first car in Israel, the only Japanese car you could get was a Subaru and a Daihatsu. Forget Toyotas, forget Hondas, they didn't sell to Israel because they all followed the Arab boycott. And this just grew, again, really, it was a little bit after 67, but it grew much more so after 1973. And I think the beauty of the situation today, in spite of what's going on with Iran, is that we see that what I said is true, that there is no Arab-Israeli conflict. Otherwise, why would the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Jordan and Egypt all have peace treaties, as problematic as they might be, but they've all got peace treaties with us. So we can no longer say that all 24 Arab countries and 40 Islamic countries are at war with Israel. It's a conflict that Israel has with the Palestinians, with the Lebanese, with the Syrians, bilateral, but there was never, I think, authenticity to the linkage between Israel and all the other Arab countries, except they made it that way.
I'm going to honor everybody's time. Mike, thank you so much again for this session. Thanks to everybody for being here. We will reconvene in a week. Look forward to being together then. Good health and well-being to us all. We'll see
Stay
you.
safe.
Be
Stay
safe,
healthy.
exactly, for everyone, Again, Mike, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
My
Have a great
pleasure.
rest
And
of the
Nikki,
week.
ask you, sorry, Nikki,
Everyone
ask
have a
you-
great week.
Nikki, ask you a question next week and say hi to Jim. See ya. Bye.